Is this primary race over, or has it just begun?
You asked the question, I think, around Scott Brown, and all I could think about is that Forbes magazine named Scott Brown Wall Street's favorite senator. And I was thinking, that's probably not an award I'm going to get. So for me, what this is all about, and what it's been about from the beginning for me, is about middle-class families. America's middle class has been hammered, squeezed, and chipped at for a generation now, and it can't take it much longer. This is what I work on. This is my life's work. I've done research on it. I've written about it. I've advocated for these families. When we hit a financial crisis, I went to Washington to try to work on the bank bailout and bring some transparency and accountability to it. When given the chance, I got out there and advocated for a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and then went to Washington to work to stand it up. For me, it's all about families, middle-class families.
Thank you.
The U.S. Treasury invested about $256 billion in their first series of transactions. Secretary of Treasury Paulson said when he invested it, this is just an investment on the part of the U.S. taxpayer. You're not going to lose your money. In fact, you may actually make money. And I sent him a letter, and the letter says, among other questions, are we getting a fair deal? For every $100 we're putting in, are we getting back stock and warrants worth $100? Secretary Paulson wrote a letter back to me, and he said, yes, these transactions are at or near par, which just means every time you put $100 in, you're getting $100 back in value. Right. Sounds fair, right? In other words, they're just using our money to try to defrost the system.
Right, that's what he said.
That's what he said, and he said it very clearly. Now, we could have stopped there, said thank you very much, we appreciate it, Secretary Paulson, check off the box. But we decided what we should do is make an independent investigation. And here was the bottom line. A lot of number crunching. For every $100 we put in, we got $66 back.
Well, that wasn't the deal.
That wasn't the deal. And here's the problem. You put in $100 and get 66 back. You do that often enough, and in this particular case, you end up about $78 billion short. That is what Secretary Paulson said was an even deal, missed by $78 billion.
I think people have trouble with this. Maybe boiling down, you could say, it was either a dumb mistake, maybe that's overstating, but a mistake, or the people who designed it knew how it was going to go, but didn't level with we the people.
I think that's right. I wish I could say otherwise, but I think that's right.
You think they didn't level with us?
I know they didn't level with us. I mean, for Secretary Paulson to describe this as a par transaction after he had plenty of time to think about it, he didn't describe it just as a par transaction on the day it happened, back in October. It was a letter December 30th, addressed to me as chair of oversight, and he said, oh yes, that's what it was, a par transaction, 100 for 100. And the numbers just show flatly it was not. So here's one way to look at it. In 1792, our young republic, George Washington as president, hits its first economic crisis, and credit markets freeze. Does this sound familiar? And it almost brings the country to its knees. And here's what happens. About every 15 to 20 years, we have another crisis. We called them panics. We had different names for them. Depression. But they happen about every 15 to 20 years. For 140 years, the pattern is just unmistakable. Then we hit the Great Depression. And coming out of the Great Depression, we put 3 new regulations in place. Glass-Steagall, which divides our community banks, basically from the Wall Street investment banks. FDIC insurance, put money in a bank and know that it's safe. And some SEC regulations so you can invest on Wall Street and they can't cheat you too directly. That's what we put in place. For 50 years, we have no bank failures, no major crises. It works. Now, There's innovation, there's change. It's time to change regulations. It gets to be the early 1980s. And what do? Instead of saying new products, we need to change regulations to adapt. We take a different path. We say,
You allow banks to go in the insurance business and vice
let's
versa.
deregulate. That's exactly right. We begin to break down the old regulations. We say, who needs regulations? They're so pokey, so old. So we go with this idea of let's get rid of regulation. And what happens? Late 1980s, savings and loan crisis should have been a warning. Late 1990s, remember long-term capital management, the hedge fund should have been a warning, but we let it go. Early 2000s, Enron, bad books, not telling the truth, should have been a warning, but we let it go. And where do we end up? In the biggest crisis since the Great Depression. Markets are wonderful. They produce great wealth for us. But they are, by their very nature, something we call pro-cyclical. When they're going up, they chase themselves up. Hey, wow, it's doing great. Up they go, and when they go down, they chase themselves down, and they go lower than actual supply and demand would suggest. Now look, we can live in a world of ups and downs for the rest of our lives. We can say, who needs regulation? Let's just ride that roller coaster wherever it goes. But you know, we have to remember, when it goes down, it doesn't just take down the people who gambled. It doesn't just take down the people who invested on Wall Street. It takes down everybody who's got a pension. It takes down folks who have jobs in construction industries and other industries that get hit by this. It takes down, in this case, it takes down homeowners, people who thought they were doing the right thing to protect themselves for the future. It takes down the prudent along with the gamblers and the wild ones.
Which is where we are today.
Which is exactly where we are today. So we could say, hey, no more regulation, that's fine, but look what it's brought us. We are not willing to let these big financial institutions fail. We've got this too big to fail notion, so we are going to shovel billions of dollars in their direction and still take the position we shouldn't regulate them. This is a world that may be a lot of fun for the high flyers who get theirs and keep theirs, but it's not a world that works very well for ordinary families.
What about the argument that says, quote, when you boil it down, you're talking about us becoming a socialist nation? You buy that?
You know, I'm sorry, I just think that's just silly. The argument that we're socialist, every game has rules. And this is really about where we're going to set the rules. Are the rules going to be that you can be so big and so powerful that the U.S. taxpayer ends up guaranteeing you, in effect, too big to fail, but there's no regulation? That's a crazy set of rules. If you're going to be that big, if you're going to put my future at risk, then I want to be able to say somebody has to watch you and make sure you don't take risks with what could turn out to be my money. That's not socialism. That's just good sense. You put me at risk, then I want some restrictions on what you do.
We are live on abcnews.com and Yahoo News for an original series called Newsmakers, and we're happy to be joined here by Congressman Ron Paul. Congressman, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
First question, when did you know that you wanted to become the President of the United States?
There was no precise moment. I mean, I've been interested in this projects, for a good many years. In '88, I ran. But at that time, it was a struggle because I was running in a third party. I didn't realize how biased the system was against anybody outside the mainstream, because we wouldn't get interviews like this if you're in third party. So I ran then. But it was real serious 4 years ago, but still the odds were great. But it was only this year, at the beginning of the year, that we all became aware, that is our organization and myself became aware that the country has finally come our direction. People were getting tired of the war. They were understanding that the Federal Reserve had a lot to do with the bailouts. The crisis had hit, and it's the kind of thing I had been talking about for 20 years. So that is when we got very serious about what we've been doing over all these years.
There was no moment of truth when you said, I can do that job. I know I can do it.
No, not really. That moment of truth was very gradual over 40 years where when I first got into politics, I knew with certainty deep down in my mind and heart that the country was going in the wrong direction. That, of course, had a monetary issue. Once we removed any restraint on the Federal Reserve to print money, I was completely confident, still remains confident, that that leads to big government spending, deficits, financial bubbles, and then corrections, and then destruction of production. And that's where we are today. Debt with no production, jobs are gone, but it has engulfed the whole world.
Now, you've got what Governor Branstad of Iowa called the boldest plan to cut federal spending. $1 trillion in the first year, the elimination of 5 departments. You got plenty of critics out there, but I want you to explain why you think that drastic measure will actually help create jobs.
Because we've been spending too much and printing too much and borrowing too much for so long, and it destroyed the jobs. People see cutting $1 trillion as a negative. I see it as a positive. It's taking $1 trillion out of the hands of politicians and bureaucrats. I don't have a lot of respect for them, and I want to put it back in the hands of people who have more common sense. I also, a lot of the other candidates talk about taxes, and I do too. And Republicans, you know, although we have different programs, most Republicans are against more taxes. Nobody wants to raise taxes. But I start one step back. I call spending a tax because spending means it has to be paid for. And you can pay for it by raising taxes, borrowing money, or printing money, which dilutes the value of the money. If prices go up, and that's the inflation tax. So that's the big tax. So by cutting spending, I cut taxes. If you start one step back from just saying, well, we have government, we're not going to challenge our foreign policy, we're not going to challenge the entitlement system or the special interest system in government running education and schools and just on and on. No, we'll just sort of cut proposed increases 5 years from now, and we'll pretend and we'll try to convince the people in the country that we're really cutters. So no,